Hi, welcome to the first WhiskyGal video. My plan for this channel is to make the world of whiskey more approachable for everyone. I will be touching on whiskey from around the world, but my primary focus is going to be on single malt whiskey around the world, because that is my passion. And I'm really hoping to instill some new passion in new people. But I also know it can be a little bit intimidating when you have no basis of information. So if you're just starting out from nothing, or you have some basic information, this is the channel for you. There are certain regulations that a distillery must follow in order to call their whiskey single malt. These regulations can vary slightly from country to country, but basically it's all the same. First, we'll look at the term single in the title single malt. And really what that's referring to is the fact that everything is made in one distillery, as opposed to the term blended malt, which is actually taking single malt whiskey from two or more distilleries and mixing them together. Then we'll look at what we need to start the spirit with, and that is using 100% malted barley. Now we're going to take that barley and then we're going to have to distill it using the traditional method of copper pot stills, which is also called batch distilling. Now after it's distilled, we need to age it in oak barrels for a minimum of 3 years. Most single malt whiskies are generally aged longer than that. When we hear the name Scotch, the majority of us associate it with single malt whiskey. Now that is understandable, as their single malt is some of the best and most well-known in the world. However, the name Scotch actually encompasses all whiskey that is manufactured in Scotland. So that includes blended Scotch, single grain Scotch, blended grain Scotch, blended malt Scotch, and single malt Scotch. So you can't just walk into a liquor store over there and say, I want some Scotch. Well, even over here, people should understand a little bit more that it really means it could be anything. So you have to be more specific. That kind of shows you why you can't make a whiskey over here and put their name on it. It has to be produced in Scotland. I think all of us can understand that when you associate the term Scotch as a name brand. Now, who invented whiskey anyway? There's always been some debate on this, and it's generally between Scotland and Ireland, but other people could possibly have started whiskey, as distilling has been around for eons. So we can look at the Celts for one example, as their word for their spirit was asquaba, which means water of life. And the word whiskey comes from the Gaelic word uiscebea. So there is some similarities there, and it's definitely a possibility that they brought it over. It is recorded that distilling was brought to Ireland in 432 AD by St. Patrick. But the first written record of actual whiskey being sold was in Scotland in 1494. So that's quite a big gap between those two. And again, we can only speculate, and maybe we'll get into a video one day about that. After that, of course, it became widespread in Scotland. They just kind of took it and ran with it. In the early years, whiskey is nothing like we know it today. It was simply distilled and then drank. So you can imagine how harsh and raw it would have been. It would not have been very pleasant. And interesting enough, the aging process was actually discovered by accident in the mid-18th century, when the owner of the cask forgot about it. When he rediscovered it, he tried it and realized how it had softened and more flavors were developed and became obviously much more pleasant to drink, and thus it became the new norm. The whiskey industry grew quite a bit through the 1700s and 1800s and went through many stages. Now, we're not going to go into all those details, but I will say that it went from being highly taxed and pretty illegal, where only a handful of distillers were allowed to produce, and that was in the lowlands, but that really didn't stop the smugglers from producing their own whiskey in the highlands, and I'm talking about hundreds of distilleries. It became easier in 1823 when the Excise Act came in. That dropped the taxes and kind of did away with the need for those smugglers, and so that kind of died out over time. But it also made it more profitable to have a distillery, so things became a lot easier from there on. The first laws laid out for the definition of Scotch was in 1933, with a dedicated Scotch Whisky Act in 1988, and the new regulations for Scotch came out in 2009. So as you see, there's some amazing history here. And the more I learn and understand about the production and history of whiskey, the more I enjoy drinking it. And I'm sure you will too. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you next week. Cheers.